Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Stesha Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager here at the Seattle Public Library. As we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. Here in Seattle, we're on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past and present and thank them for their stewardship of this land. Welcome to tonight's program with Douglas Stuart, which is presented in partnership with Elliott Bay Book Company. We're grateful to our author series sponsor, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, and to the Seattle Times for their generous support of library programs. Thank you as well to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. I'd like to give a big hello and welcome to all of our attendees here at Central Library and also watching the live stream. This is just, I think, the fourth event that we've been doing in person since 2020. So we're getting our feet wet and learning how to do the live stream thing. So bear with us, but also isn't it great to make the program that much more accessible? I have just a few announcements before we get started. First, I wanted to mention that Douglas's book, Young Mungo, was chosen by the library as a peak pick, which is our collection of popular high interest titles chosen just for Seattle readers. You might have seen the big display out as you came in with the little 5 balloon. Since it was launched 5 years ago, Peak Picks has become one of our most beloved services because the books are immediately available to readers with no holds and no wait. And I am happy to say that there's only one of Douglas's books left on this big display because everybody else has already snatched them up to read them. We have a few other events coming up that might be of interest. On May 16th, Putsada Reang will be here to talk about her new memoir, Ma and Me. And the following night, Angela Garbus will be here to talk about her book, Essential Labor, Mothering as Social Change. And finally, on May 19th, the wonderful Claudia Castro Luna will be here to celebrate the release of her newest poetry collection. And I know that our friends over at Elliott Bay Book Company have more information about all of those events at their table. And you know what else Elliott Bay has? They have copies of Douglas's books. So if you're here with us tonight in person, they have copies on the table just to your right. And if you're watching online, you can find books at Elliott Bay's website, elliottbaybook.com. Douglas is happy to sign books for folks that are here in person after the event. We're requesting that folks stay masked in the personalization line just for everybody's safety. And for folks here at the library, you might have noticed that the door became a wall. And so if you need to exit the auditorium during the program, you'll just use that door to your right that says Children's Center. And the lobby, which you'll use to exit, is just directly behind me in front of you. Oh, and the restrooms will be open for the duration of the event, even though the library is closed. So after tonight's conversation, there's going to be time for questions from the audience. For folks here in person, I gave you a little index card. You can use that to write your questions, and then I'll collect them toward the end of the event. And folks watching online, you can ask your question at any time by writing it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we're interested in hearing from you. Toward the close of the event, we'll post a link to a survey in the chat, and we'll collect the paper surveys for folks who are leaving the in-person program. Now, I am delighted to introduce tonight's speakers, the reason we're all here. Douglas Stuart is a Scottish-American author. His New York Times bestselling debut novel, Shuggie Bain, won the 2020 Booker Prize and the Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. It was also the winner of 2 British Book Awards, including Book of the Year. It was also a finalist for the National Book Award, Penn Hemingway Award, National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, the Kirkus Prize, as well as several other literary awards. Stuart's writing has appeared in the New Yorker and in LitHub. He's going to talk tonight with our friend Rick Simonson. Rick has worked as a bookseller at Elliott Bay Book Company since 1976. Right? He's a book buyer there and also coordinates with Karen Maeda Ullman, Elliott Bay's long-running reading series. Rick has served on boards for the King County Arts Commission, Copper Canyon Press, the Central District Forum for Arts and Ideas, Seattle City of Literature, on which board I also serve with Rick, and the University of Washington Press. And Rick has also served as a juror for the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association, Seattle Arts and Lectures, Hedgebrook, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Story Prize, the National Book Award, and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. Wow. Please help me welcome Douglas Stuart and Rick Simonson.
I think I'm unmuted.
I think we're on. Thank you, Stasha. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is the first. We just started at LA doing in-person and programs after 2 years of only virtual. So I'm still a little confused because there's people watching like this where I have to hold the book up like that to see it, or we will have little waves at the end for the way we've been doing on screens, but not so much when we're all together. We who are here. So Stasha, in her introduction to Douglas, gave a lovely recitation of all the awards and honors that came to Shuggie Bain, Douglas's first book, which is published at the beginning of 2020. And we'll get more into some of the stories of his journey as a writer, both before books were published, but then since they've been published. But he's had two, Shuggie Bain and now Young Mungo, published during this time that we're in. He's been published by the publisher Grove Press in New York. There's an editor at the independent publisher Grove Press named Peter Blackstock, who the first thing I'd ask you is, have you done any of these with Peter, your editor? Oh, okay, well, to get back to a little bit more of that, but this is a brilliant young editor who, Grove Press, this editor has done the writer Viet Thanh Nguyen, who did The Sympathizer. He did the writer Akwaeke Emeze, who did this amazing book, Freshwater. And he did, first did Douglas's Shuggie Bain. These were all books that got rejected by everybody. Shuggie Bain got rejected by at least 30 publishers. Like, they was like, we like it, but we can't figure out how to sell it. Grove is Peter is an editor, and Grove is a publisher that will believes in the books and believes such books will find a readership. And obviously, Shuggie Bain has, and now Young Mungo. So that's a little bit of background about the strange things about these awards and honors. I mean, you can read the little recitation that Stasha did, make it sound like, yes, we all knew this was in the works all along, but it's usually not the case. Douglas, welcome to Seattle.
Thank you very much. It's good to see everybody. I didn't get to leave the house for 3 years, so it's great. And in fact, about rejection, Peter was the only person who offered on Shuggie Bain. And when it took me 10 years to write the book, I don't know if you knew that, but when my agent was sending the book out on submission, she said to me, "Do you want to know when you get some feedback?" And I said, "Yes, because it will make me a better writer." And I was so sure that I wouldn't get rejected. And in about a 2-week period, I got rejected 20 times. And actually, the night that I won the Booker, a journalist asked me about rejection. And I said, well, this is how it was. And I was rejected 20 times. And my agent cut in and she said, "You were rejected 44 times. I just stopped telling you." And so I wasn't quite the man that I thought I was. I wasn't the big boy. But the day that Peter actually offered was the day before I got married. And you're right, he's the only editor who would publish my work. And he was sitting across from me. He's a young man. He's a very handsome young man. He was sitting across from me in this conference room, and he was kind of holding my manuscript. And he said, he said, "If you don't change any word about this manuscript, I still want to publish it. I still want to do it." And he said, "Here's your offer." And I said, "Thank you. I'll think about it." And my agent took me out into the street, and she turned to me and said, "What have you got to think about?" Like, but I was just so overwhelmed.
Yeah. Peter also, though, is like you, has sort of a dual Anglo over here background, because we'll get more to it, but this is your first time in Seattle, which I figure in weather and we were saying this a little beforehand, in weather and grayness and all that probably more resembles Glasgow than your home city than anywhere else in the US. If you miss that part of home, you can always come west to see that the gray and the green, all of those together here. So we're going to talk. Let me do this though before we get too far. Who here has read Shuggy? I gotta get the pronunciations right, Shuggy. Okay. Who's read Young Mungo? Pretty good. Okay, we've got some. Well, we're mostly we're gonna talk primarily about Young Mungo, but I think when we get to questions at the end, when you write those, either book, both books are fine. But Shuggy's had a chance, miraculous as it has been, to live. I mean, for readers, you did Zoom readings and things like that for Shuggy, and but now you're getting to be out. So Sasha didn't get into the bones of the book, which for those of you who've read Shuggy and those of you who read both will know there's some interesting parallels in storylines. The protagonist, the youngest male protagonist, is in the title of both books, and there's a somewhat similar family structure going on in both books. And then other things happen, but the books also are different. Talk first about Young Mungo and what's going on in its story of this young fellow, Mungo Hamilton, and his mother and brother and sister, as the book sets out. There's a few journeys in the book, but
yeah, it was a book actually that I began writing in 2016, and when I wrote Shuggy Bain, I wanted it to be a very pure book. It was about filial love. It was about a son's love for his mother, and I didn't want anything else to cloud that love. And it left me with a huge desire to write a novel about first love, about first queer love, but how it intersects with the working class or with poverty, because I think the consequences are so different. And so Mungo Hamilton's a 15-year-old boy growing up in post-Thatcher's Glasgow. And he is a young man who's the youngest of the family, but his mother's a bit of a rascal. She keeps disappearing and running away and just vanishing because she's ready to get on with her own life again. She's a very young woman. She's raised her 3 children. But Mungo is being torn between his elder brother and his elder sister. His elder brother is the leader of a local gang and wants Mungo always to man up, to be harder, to be tougher, to be more violent. And his sister is a really bright, capable, intelligent young woman who is going to run the world one day, but only if she can survive her 2 brothers, because she has the burden of caring for her younger brother, but she also has her older brother is quite a violent young man. But it's a love story, and Mungo falls in love with another young man that lives a couple of streets away from him, actually lives across the back gardens, and they live in the tenements of the East End. And that's a taboo for the time and the place, because the first taboo is it's 2 men that fall in love. But the second taboo is Mungo is a Protestant and the younger brother of the Protestant gang leader, and the man he falls in love with, James, is a Catholic. And so this is a really dangerous love for these young men, and it's threatened on every side. They're performing their masculinity when they're out on the streets every single day. And yet when they're alone and they're together, it's a very tender, very beautiful place to be. But it's a novel that's told in 2 plats that sort of wraps around itself in a way, because the first part of it takes place on the streets of Glasgow, but the second part takes place in the wilds of Scotland, in the north next to a lochside. And Mungo has essentially been sent away with 2 men who are friends of his mother's to get him out of the city, to get him away from the trouble he's been in, but also to learn some masculine pursuits. It's a comment on that time where we thought the best place for young boys was around men, any men. You know, we lived in quite a naive world where we thought no matter who it was a good place to be. And for the most part it is, but we definitely know now that that's not always without its consequences.
Yes, that part, the woods, the rural part feels like some deep, dark fairy tale. I mean, like a fairy tale gone a certain way, because does have it's away from the city dangers, but then there are the dangers that are out there. But there's also some beauty. There's a lot of rain too, though it gets wet. You maybe read a little bit from, if you have a little portion here, we were talking about the voice of the book. Voices of the book, I mean, are beautiful, and reading this, I wanted to hear the whole book read. But yes.
You can pay me to do that.
Yes.
I'll come around to your house and do that for a fee. But this is actually when James and Mungo are just friends at the beginning. They're quite lonely young men. They can't quite fit in. Mungo's very lonely, but James raises pigeons on some open ground in a ducat, or you might know it as a dovecote. But they're both motherless sons for different reasons, and they spend their first night together just as friends. James's bedroom was a mess. The walls were thick with posters pinned layer upon layer. Clothes, clean and dirty, lay in heaps on the floor. In the corner of the room was a pile of old canary cages modified to transport pigeons. Above these was a Twitcher's map of Scotland, lochs and hillsides in glorious detail, each glen filled in with a type of bird an enthusiast could expect to find there. James had circled some far-flung places to disappear to. The boys lay together, with James facing upwards and Mungo with his head at James's feet, head to toe in the single bed. They took great pains not to touch. If one moved his leg too close, the other shifted and hung off the side of the narrow mattress. "What's your ma like?" asked James in the darkness. It was hard to describe such a thing. You only got one mother. It didn't bear a comparison, and she didn't come with a list of features like a new oven. "I don't know. She's just my ma." Mungo had never considered it before. He could hear James picking an old sticker from his headboard. "Well, does she like to dance?" "Aye." "Does she like to sing?" "More so when she's drunk." Mungo's eyes were open in the darkness. The room looked strange and somehow familiar. He would have thought a Catholic's bedroom would have been bare, or perhaps crucifixes everywhere, but there were none. He kept expecting to roll over and see Hamish eating cereal in his bed. "You know, my sister says she's not a mother at all. She says we were just a mistake that happened to a stupid young lassie, and that she's regretted it ever since. After my dad died, Momo decided she was going to put herself first. That's not what mammies are supposed to do." Well, that's another thing Jodie says. Mungo didn't want to talk about them anymore. "What was yours like?" "Oh, she was the business." James said it really quickly. "Even when she was sick, she pretended like she wasn't. Every day I came home from school, she wouldn't let me get out of her hug until I told her everything that had happened. If Geraldine got home after me, she had to wait in line for her hug. It could take pure ages. My mammy called it the juicing. She said if she didn't hold us tight, we would ignore her, so she squeezed us as hard as she could to get all of the good stuff out of us. She wouldn't let us go until you tell her absolutely everything." That sounds nice. Aye, it was. James coughed like there was a clog in his throat, and Mungo could tell he was breathing deeply to keep himself from crying. Mungo didn't know what to do. He reached out a hand and felt the sharpness of James's shin bone. He made a fist and tapped along the bone, up and down, the way a doctor would probe a fracture. He waited for James to pull away, but he didn't, and Mungo folded first. He drew back his hand, and he laid it in the center of his chest. Thank you.
How much would you charge to read the whole book? No. So there's beautiful, you're roughly the same age as, I believe, as Mungo and maybe Shuggie, in terms of having grown up in this era post-Thatcher Britain, where Scotland, where social services have been decimated, and also the whole functional economy is basically like, there's men in this book who've lost their livelihoods, their work. So there's a lot of that. A lot of those men are not so centered in the book, but it's sort of off. You know, that's also part of the problem that everyone's dealing with. So you have Mungo learning these things about himself, about his attraction, and there are a few other characters in the book that speak to that, but he's having to find out. They're trying to find that out, and with sort of family pressure against it, although his own family is not religious particularly. How, for you writing this, how much of this was looking back at a period that you knew in life?
I'm always really surprised when I write my novels, because I think some people take them as historical fiction, and the truth is it happened in my lifetime, or it's it's not that far away, and it's testament to how far we've come as people and how far we still have to go. But I think we do such a job of erasing queer history or not talking about it, and certainly not when it intersects with the working class. And so Mungo's a young man that's coming up under Thatcher's government. Her power is still felt in the book. And he's coming up under Section 28, which is exactly the same as the Florida law that says, don't say gay. You're not allowed to talk to anyone about alternative sexuality. And so as young men or young women, there was nowhere to turn. You didn't feel supported by the government. He's growing up under the fear of AIDS, and he's also coming of age in a time where he doesn't have any visibility for the internet or email or being able to see these things. So he feels incredibly alone, as I also felt incredibly alone as a young man. And in a way, writing the book is a bit of wish fulfillment, because I'd always wished that, I knew that there was other young queer people around me in the house and estate I grew up in. We just couldn't have any visibility. We couldn't reach out and sort of connect with each other. And so that's the heart of this book, where he has that connection. But it's just a different set of consequences for this young man, because he's coming of age in a time when unemployment in his community is about 26%. And it's been holding there for a while. So you're right. So a lot of men and women have lost their jobs, but they've also lost their identities in a way. His older brother has really been infected by some kind of cynicism. At first, the unemployment didn't feel like it was going to last for forever. And then it started to feel intergenerational, and it felt like hope wasn't going to come. And so Hamish, his brother, is a little bit like an Irvine Welsh character. He's really sort of abandoned all hope, and he's dragging Mungo along behind him. And Mungo is having to find out what his future is going to be in this place. And the thing that's most difficult for him is the masculinity around him is quite narrow, is quite narrowly expressed. And that's even for heterosexual men. You had to be a very certain type of man, where you had to be hardworking and hard fighting and hard loving and hard drinking. And any kind of sort of poetic inclination or tenderness or weakness or softness was seen as quite feminine, and therefore was seen as something to be attacked in a way. And Mungo, as a young queer man, is really performing that. He's running with the gangs around him. James is chasing girls in order just to fit in. And yet they can't, because they're so on the outside of it. And so it's about sort of opening up the spectrum of masculinity, I think. I think that's why I wanted to write the book, because I tried to fill in all the silence that was there for Scottish manhood or masculinity in a way, because we're often known as quite a heterosexual, quite a stoic, quite a silent place. And I've always known that there was far more frequencies to it than that.
The tenderness between Mungo and James is really striking in the book, because there's, and I don't think I'm giving it away, but there's a moment where Mungo expects any affection to be preceded by some sort of violence, or at least some sort of tension, or because between men and women, even within his family, is with his sister, with his brother, with his mother, could be some battle or some, if not fisticuffs, and then the tenderness can come in.
That's right. Yeah. I don't think we did a good job of teaching young men how to be tender with each other, or to be tender with girls. I don't think we rewarded that behavior in young boys. And so Mungo and James, when they even start to discover their love for each other, it's always preceded with some wrestling or some roughhousing or some kind of sports maneuver, because they just don't know how to go to love, first of all, and to say, oh, I think you're amazing. I think you're beautiful. And so they're kind of fumbling towards it. And certainly when I was a young boy, the only way that men were allowed to touch each other was either in sports or in fighting.
Right.
We wouldn't throw our arms around each other. We wouldn't hug. We wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that with my brother. Wouldn't do that with the men in my family. It just wasn't how we were. And so I used to hate sports, but I used to love like getting crushed in a scrum, because it was some kind of contact. And so it really stuck with me, that feeling, how no one had ever taught me how to be gentle in a way.
Some of the heterosexual exchanges are more with the lips. I mean, where James is going to kiss a young girl, but it's sort of like the last season, the lads are being together, and these little adolescent moments, and it's like showing each other that they know what to do, and they don't really know what to do. You said you started writing this in 2016. When was this, Shuggie? When did you start that? I'm going to work my way back a little bit here.
Yeah, I started Shuggie in 2008. And I was working in fashion at the time. I was a person that came to books really late in life. We didn't read as kids. We were literate, but we just didn't have books at home, and there wasn't so many books in our community. We just didn't think that literature in the UK was talking to us. And so we got on without it. And it didn't make us any less creative or compassionate or curious. It just meant books weren't part of our life. But when I'm 18, my school, first of all, my mother dies when I'm 16. And I'd spent a lot of my childhood caring for my mother because she wasn't very well. But then school emptied out. Of the 250 kids in my year at school, only about 12 of us came back to finish high school all the way through. And so suddenly I was in English classes where it was just me and a teacher. And he couldn't quite teach me because it's hard to teach just one person. So he just had me read. And that's when books became everything for me. But I spent I spent a lifetime designing textiles. I'm a knitter, actually, by trade, a very Scottish thing to be. And I began to write young Shuggie Bain in 2008 when I was at the height of my fashion career, because I had this huge desire to express this story. First of all, I felt like no one really knew me as an entire human being. Anyone that saw me from fashion, it was quite a rarefied world. And so my family didn't understand it from Glasgow. And then anyone that I worked with in fashion didn't understand where I'd come from. They thought I'd come from some place of privilege, maybe like they had. And so I just felt very disconnected. I felt like a person divided. And so Shuggie became a very personal project for me. It was explaining a world to myself. It was processing some things from my childhood. But it took me 10 years to write it. In fact, the first draft of it was 1,800 pages because I didn't have a plan. And I don't know if anybody's a writer in the audience, but I had 2 huge legal binders. They were about that thick. And it took me about 2 years to write the first draft. And I wouldn't allow myself to admit that I was writing a book because I felt very intimidated by that idea. Instead I was writing a sentence, a paragraph, this story. And I turned to my husband after 2 years and I say to him, will you read this? And I give him these 2 huge legal binders. And the guy went, yeah, all right, like this. He just went, oh, yeah, okay. He didn't know what to say. And I gave him about 4 hours and I sat in the other room and I was listening to him sigh and laugh. And I went in and I said, are you finished? And he went, yeah, I'm not finished. And actually it took him about 7 months to read it. And for the first 200 pages, he gives me the most thoughtful feedback. He attends to every metaphor of the world I'm building, the characters, with a very fine pen, and he's very thoughtful. And then about page 200, he still has 1,600 to go. The will to live just leaves his body. And you can see it in his notes. And he just gets this fat Sharpie and starts redacting it. And so that was it. That was the only reader I had for all of Shuggie's life. He read that first draft. And in fact, after 7 months, when he gave it back to me, I was so offended he'd touched my work that I didn't speak to him for 7 weeks. And so I was working on Shuggie for 10 years, but about the 8-year mark, the book is done. I never know if it's going to be published. Certainly almost wasn't published. And so I sit down to begin writing young Mungo. Mungo was, if Shuggie didn't know the kind of kid he was going to be, Mungo knew exactly who he was.
Definitely more of an assertive
That's right, yeah.
person in Mungo.
There really is. And I came with a full plot. I'd learned all my lessons as a writer and taught myself my craft. And the book just sort of burst out of me. But I started it in 2016 and Shuggie wasn't published to 2020.
So this, again, because so many writers in this country come out of writing programs and kind of, ways fostering, trying to, generate novels or books of poetry. You doing this was you're in the US by then. So this is
New York, yeah.
The distance from that time and that place is in you. Were you going back and forth? You have family there still.
Yeah, my family still live on the streets that I write about. And so my family are still right there. And Glasgow's still my home. It's the only place I actually make full sense. I just live in New York for work. I've adopted it as my home. But I think the best thing a writer can ever have is perspective and distance. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I didn't know my childhood was especially weird or unusual when I was a kid. I had such a comfort of ignorance because everybody around me was a bit poor. Everybody around me had addiction in some way. They were suffering, they were struggling. We weren't just this one family that was having a tough time in a community that was flourishing. We were all going through something or other. And there was a huge amount of comfort in that. There was a solidarity. But as I become a young man and I step away and then I get older, I see that not everybody lived like that actually it was a very unusual thing. And then there's really weird things that come out to me. Sectarianism is really strange, actually, when it's taken from a Scottish point of view, because it's not really a fight about identity. It's a fight about tribalism. Who do you identify with? And so there was always these really small things that jumped out to me in New York. And I thought, I've got to make sense of this.
As reading both books, sort of, as I read Young Mungo and reread Shuggie, there's those people that kind of lament the loss of certain forms of connection. This book, it sort of works against too much family, too much tribe, and that kind of, kind of close sense that way that these characters, it feels almost claustrophobic at times. The Glasgow parts where they can't get out. So, back a little bit of you as the public life now with the books out for Shuggie. Now this, I'm sure you were hearing from people virtually before you were able to go traveling, but you have been now over with the books home. Mm-hmm. What's the response been like there, including has anyone from your old days turned out who say was queer but hadn't ever, I mean, I would think it's got to be really speaking to a lot of young men and women and others of now changed other gender feeling about what you were striking that they lived through or have lived through.
Yeah, I think that was part of the Shuggy's and Mungo's Shuggy's difficult road to publication. Is people thought it was a very specific book about a specific time and place, and in fact, it's about the universal human condition. And some of the best connections I've had has been in Pittsburgh, and people in Pittsburgh can deeply understand what Shuggy and Agnes went through. Philadelphia, Albany, Naples, Italy. All these different places that have gone through deindustrialization really quickly and suffered for it. And that's been the most wonderful thing. It was incredible to go home to Scotland. The city painted a mural for Shuggy Bain on one of our most important buildings. It will last for 25 years. And I would have felt I had enough success had I just been able to publish my book, but it wouldn't have felt right if Glasgow and Scotland hadn't embraced it. But Agnes and Shuggy, they understand very profoundly. They're very protective of them in a city. But it's one amazing thing to see this 80-foot by 40-foot mural that will last for 25 years. There are words that were inspired by Glasgow projected back on Glasgow. But Glasgow will never let you get too big for your boots, because the last time I was there was about 3 weeks ago, and I was standing with the evening newspaper and they were taking photos of me in front of the mural. I don't get to go home too often. And as they were taking photos of me, two guys came along and had a pee against the mural. They just came up the road and they just got their penises out and they just peed against it. And we just all had to wait for them to finish. But it was a beautiful moment. It was funny.
Well, that sounds like the scene from both books that could well have happened. That's actually, that's great.
Keeps you grounded.
Yeah. In a way, because we were talking about male, affection and ability to be more tender. How do you see the situation in these books for the women? The mother, certainly, I'll listen to Mungo. The mother and the sister, the primary women in the books. There's also Mrs. Campbell as a character. Who's in there?
Yeah, I think it's a patriarchy, but when I started to write Shuggy Bain, it was hard. I thought I was going to write it from an 8-year-old boy's point of view, and I thought he was going to explain the whole world to you and he was going to take you through it. And the minute I started to write, really, a chorus rushed in, because I couldn't locate the blame and I couldn't get to the core of the hurt. Because every time someone was hurt, someone had hurt them, and then someone had hurt that person, and it had gone on. And that sounds like an Instagram cliche, but it was true in this moment. It was, there was always an origin for it somewhere else. And it became just a much more complicated book, hopefully a bit more nuanced, because I allowed different characters to look at the same problem, but from different lenses, which gave you that perspective. But people ask me if writing Shuggy Bain was cathartic for me. It was, but not in the way that anybody ever expects. It was cathartic because I got to look at homophobia, misogyny, addiction, poverty, and then I got to consider the situation of what brought the characters to that point. And if you make a character do something bad in fiction that you don't like what they're doing, you still have to deeply understand why they did it, why that choice is right for them, what in their world has changed that made them need to do that. As I've spoken about, I lost my mother to addiction, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to figure out, why was that? What got my mother to that point? Because my God, she was bright and she was beautiful and she had so much potential and she was so well loved. And yet she still couldn't see a way out. She couldn't see hope for tomorrow. And the catharsis for me was considering that pain and going through it. And I say that to you because you asked about masculinity, because I think we very quickly blame men for a lot. And I don't think we spend enough time reflecting on how hard things can be for men. I grew up in a time where men weren't allowed any spectrum of emotion. You were allowed to be strong, you were allowed to be angry, you were allowed to be a bit violent, and people understood if you were violent because, of course, they knew you were holding things in. But my God, to go down into a coal mine, to go to a steel crag, to build a ship that's 60 foot in the air in all weather, and for no one to say to you, are you all right? Do you have other ambitions? Do you want to do this? Are you scared? What is it? No one would ever say that to the men around me. And so they became very quiet people. And through writing Shuggy Bain, I had so much more sympathy for that. I could understand it. And young Mungo comes from that same place. We have to look at the hurt that men can bring into the world, but we have to know that the world has brought them to that point. They're not necessarily, they didn't get there on their own account.
Were you in your life more able to come out over still in Scotland, or would that happen more over here in New York?
Yeah, I came out when I was about 18 because I was orphaned, and so I was on my own. So there was no one to come out to be totally honest,
Right.
other than myself. And so I know I got to do it, and I was really proud to see that Glasgow was voted the 8th best place in the world for queer people to live today, and in all the cities in the world. And so that's what I mean about like history's moving really quickly, but we erase our stories quickly as well. We're heading towards a bright future, and we forget how it was.
And what you do beautifully in both books in a way is give that history that is hard to read. I mean, it's painful to read what people are saying and doing to each other, and yet that's part of that history, and for people to know that was lived through. And
I always had to reckon with homophobia because I think we think that people who used to be homophobic were all terrible people. And I actually don't think that was true at all. I just think oftentimes society lacks education. And I think that's been a lot of what we've done around a lot of issues. But I think there was a lot of people that were really hard to gay people when I was younger, but they just didn't know any better way to be. I don't think they were fundamentally bad people. I just think society propped it up. I mean, I grew up in a time when on the front page of the newspapers, it could say words like benders or big, big whatever slur for a queer person.
Yeah.
It could put it on the front of a national newspaper. And when Freddie Mercury came out, it was all of that. And it was just, there was so much of it. And it was all the way through society in a way. And people are always capable of change. It's just they didn't know how to be.
In Mungo, you do have this whole part out of the city. And was that something you knew also? I mean, that because Shuggie is pretty much all urban, and Shuggie and Mungo has that feel. But then this move, which you've said a little bit is part of its some male rites of passage potentially there, but you also, yeah, well, I'm going back to what you were just saying. Sorry, I'm jumping around it like if I were in a normal conversation. The part of where, because you do have that part where people see Shuggie or Mungo and make these comments like you're poofed or there's another slur, but they by sight they sort of can tag how he seems to be, or by reputation within things. So there's also that part of the way people can talk about each other, and or similarly, James as being Catholic is known. That was that's Hamish knows about James from earlier history with him. But I'm sorry, that was my little going back to that. Say a little more about the whole part of Mungo, which is outdoors and which is camping and it's cold and wet.
Yeah. So Mungo is actually named after the patron saint of Glasgow, who's Saint Mungo, who's a very beloved figure in Glasgow. He has 4 miracles where he brings a bird back to life and makes a bell ring. He does these very childlike miracles, but Glasgow loves him. And he was named, my character's named Mungo because he's trying to heal some divisions within his family. But he goes to the north of Scotland with 2 men, and one is called Gallagate, but the other one's called St. Christopher. He's named himself St. Christopher. His name's not actually St. Christopher. He has a name from Alcoholics Anonymous, and he goes to meetings on a Sunday and Thursday. And so they've called him Sunday, Thursday Christopher, which he has foreshortened to St. Christopher. But these are 3 tragicomic characters that end up in the Scottish wilderness. And they have 2 bags of alcohol, they have cans of lagers, and then they have a tent. And they're going to have this marvelous weekend by a lochside where they hunt and they fish and they learn how to do these things. And of course, you can't show up in the wilds of Scotland in a Canadian tuxedo, as you'd call it. They're wearing like head to toe denim. And so it's a weekend that unveils all of its horrors. But I was thinking a lot about how when I was a young man, Glasgow is only about 20 miles away from the gateway to the north. It's, the Scottish Highlands are really stunning. And I didn't see them till I was about 16. I never got out of the city and saw the majesty of Scotland. And I remember when we first went, I actually went with my big brother, and he loaded his car and we drove north. And he parked in a lay-by maybe about 40 minutes outside of the city. And then we pitched the tent next to the lay-by. And so we had all this country available to us, and we didn't know what to do in it. And so we stayed in the car, and then we pitched the tent, and then we slept in the tent for about 2 hours, and then we slept in the car. And so as inner city kids, we just didn't know what to do. And so Mungo like is faced with all this beauty and all this stunning nature, and he can't even process it. He doesn't know what the flowers are called. He doesn't quite know how to look at water or to nature or any of this. And it's as he's finding his orientation in the first timeline, he's so disoriented in the other timeline, and they wrap around each other for me in that way. But I was thinking about, you know, how poverty doesn't allow us to see things that are on our doorstep, and Mungo doesn't know if he's on the far side of a hill and Glasgow's just on the other side, or if he's 200 miles in the north of the country. He doesn't know.
Yeah, there's how that all ends is not to be talked of here because that gets into spoiler territory. Except I will say, in that setting, it feels like Mungo really finds out things about himself, and resorts to things that he resorts to tactics and methods that he probably didn't know he had, or at least didn't seem to, because of the situation with the family or whatever. He was the baby of the family, and everything kind of treated that way.
Yeah.
He suddenly was.
I think we've all got a capacity inside us to do whatever it takes to survive. And I think only when that's tested will you know what you're capable of. But everyone keeps asking Mungo to be a man. And he's sent to the north of Scotland to make a man out of him. And he emerges a man. He just doesn't emerge the man that any of them would have imagined.
Right. Especially coming down with probably moving to a time to have your questions in here as well. I don't know if she's bringing the ones. Is that how that works, Stasha? Okay. Okay, we'll keep going.
It's a very glamorous descent you have there.
This is all new, this hybrid and in-person thing, like, and that we're doing the questions this way. So, are you working on anything now?
Well, we're hopeful actually that Shuggie Bain is going to come to the screen.
There is, that's why I said part of these to ask, yes.
Yeah, so we're hopeful. Nothing's ever on camera until it's on camera, I think. And so I don't have too much to say, but I've enjoyed translating the story for drama. It's been such a challenge. I wasn't sure I wanted to do it when I was first approached for it. But then I had to think about how important telly was for me as a kid. And there's certainly people in my community, people in my family who haven't read the book, but who would get a lot out of the, you know, the sort of the series adaptation. And so it's been really fun. But when you change a novel to fit the screen, you change the medium entirely. And it means the story changes, which has been a thrill for me because it's allowed me to enhance it in different ways. But it's also been really interesting because it's allowed me to bring characters that I loved that I couldn't give much page space to, Leek and Lizzie, and to really allow them their full arcs. So fingers crossed it happens.
There's a little more, sort of circling back to, because you were writing, you started to write, it was for Shuggie, and just writing without calling it a book. What were you feeling forms of validation? I mean, you're waiting for your husband to approve. This was just a mission to write and see where it went, and you didn't. You weren't part of any literary. Were you reading though, or were?
Yeah, I'm a voracious
Were you
reader.
reading? Yeah.
I read anything.
Okay.
I read anything I can get my hands on. But yeah, I mean, I began Young Mungo without Shuggie ever having been published and never knew that it would be. And that was okay for me because the point was the writing. The point was to create the work. But there's so many people who have guided me on my journey, writers that have been so important. I couldn't be here without James Kelman.
I was going to ask, yeah.
You know, and it's so funny, we talk about how the world changes so quickly in such a short period of time, but I was doing an event in Bath in the UK last week or the week before, and there was a woman in the front, and it came to question time, and she was so excited. And I said, okay, what's your question? She said, congratulations on Shuggie Bain being translated into 40 languages. But my question for you is when will it be translated into English? And it was such a bad question. But my point was, James, when he wrote his novel that won in 1992, it created such an outcry because it was written in the vernacular, it was written in the dialect, it was a stream of consciousness. And yet Shuggie has had such a different embrace. And I couldn't be here. You asked me who I read. I couldn't be here without James because he broke so many barriers for so many of us. But there's Alan Warner, there's Agnes Owens, there's Janice Galloway. I'm in love with two young Scottish writers today, Jenny Fagan and Kirsten Innes. And so there's so much to discover about Scottish literature.
Yeah, James Kilman, we talked a little before, how late it was, how late, that 19, and now he's sort of, the people don't talk about him as much, but that book was really important, and other writers right after that book came out were Irvin Welsh and Duncan MacLean and some others got more visibility and voice, but it's
created
great
a
that
moment. Yeah, he
you,
created
for you
space.
even that's also part of all this is how you bring James Kilman's name back into this too, so.
But I felt that moment, like, because I was a young man when the judges sort of stormed out in protest at his win and said that anything that wasn't written in received pronunciation was an act of literary vandalism. You know, anything that's written in a regional accent. And for me, as a young writer or as someone who might want to write in my tongue, I felt very silenced by that. You know, it's a very classist response. It's a very imperial response. And it's taken us a while to break that down, but I think that's the journey of diversity in publishing. And I also think when you use a regional accent or use a dialect, readers are curious. That's why we read, right? We want to step into worlds that aren't our own. We want to put our feet into shoes and be immersed in it. And so I never had any doubt that I was doing the right thing because I also chose instantly to be on the side of Shuggie and Agnes. So I couldn't write a book that didn't include them in the prose. They had to be in every sentence of it. Their experience had to be in every bit of it.
Have you heard anything from people who've translated either the books into the other languages, how they work with the?
Yeah, actually, there was an event at the Sorbonne. First of all, I should tell you that the translators, there's 40 of them, and they have a Facebook help group. And I'd never look at it, but they've got this sort of like self-help group where they just discuss what these words mean and what the language is. And I had a look once and it got to about 400 pages and I thought, oh, that's not for me. I got to get out of there, you know, this sort of thing. But we did a thing in the Sorbonne where 5 of them, the Hebrew, the Norwegian, the Finnish, I think the French, and one other who escapes me, all flew in and we spoke about the art of translation because they're translating a book that is written in English, but it uses Scots words, it uses contractions for Glaswegian. And their biggest challenge was how do you take a Glaswegian family and put them in France? Because you can't make them sound like they're from Marseille because then that would just confuse everybody. And so what every translator came to the agreement of is they invented an urban language all of their own that doesn't have a regional position within that country. And it's really phenomenal. It's really phenomenal that they did that.
I was wondering, one of those, a story like that years ago I heard was Alice Walker's Color Purple, The Color Purple. The Norwegian translation to get the Black vernacular, Southern vernacular, they had these people living way up north that who had a certain Norwegian dialect, and that's what they used to give that Norwegian. So we can imagine some resourcefulness being needed. So let's do some questions from here, and if Stasha gives us a clue. First one I got here is favorite supporting characters or moments of Shuggie Bain, and which characters make you laugh? That's
actually, I think a character that makes me laugh that nobody thinks is very funny is Ginty McClinchy. I love her as a character. Yeah, somebody said yes, yes. I love Ginty. She's like she's a fierce woman, but she's really funny. She's everything about her mannerisms, how she comes into a room is fully Ginty. But my favorite character in the book, I have 2, and one is Leek Bain, the middle brother, and the other is Leanne Kelly at the end. And they just do different things in that novel. But Leek for me is the future of masculinity. He's a heterosexual man. He's very kind. He's very tender. He's very quiet. He's reserved. He makes a huge sacrifice in the novel and doesn't ask for any reward for it. And so I have a real soft spot for him. But he's also a timeless British question about how hard it is for working class men to lay down their burden and to elevate themselves into education. Because we don't, it's a hard thing to do. And Leanne is just great because she's that first female friend that saves many a gay man's life. And I think we've all had them. I think many gay men have them, where we might not feel like we fit in with the boys, and then suddenly we make a female friend who just sees us and gives us friendship and gives us love and lets us know that we're okay. And so Leanne's the symbol of that for me.
Let me do another one here, and then Stasha, I think, has a question from someone online. Is the tension between Catholic and Protestant that's quite evident in Glasgow throughout Scotland as much, or is that more heightened in the cities?
Yeah, it's something that focuses more on the west coast of the United Kingdom. You know, there's been problems in the UK between Catholic and Protestants since the Reformation, since England invaded Ireland, since the, you know, Scottish people went to Northern Ireland, since the Irish came to Scotland. But it's a very strange flavor in the west coast of Scotland because it doesn't really hang on identity the way it does in Northern Ireland. It isn't about, are you British or are you Irish? Because if you cut everyone down the middle, it would be, we're Scottish. We're absolutely united in our Scottishness. And also, we're pretty secular. We're actually not that religiously observant. So what it becomes is it becomes a recreational thing or a tribal thing for young working class men, particularly in the south side of the east end of Glasgow. It's legitimized by sport. I don't know if you know, in Scotland and Glasgow, we had two big football teams, Glasgow Rangers or Glasgow Celtic. It's often a shorthand. Someone will say, who do you support? And you say, I support Glasgow Celtic, and they know that you're saying you're a Catholic. And so it becomes that kind of thing. But oftentimes it's a thing that's just for a way for young working class men to identify themselves, to root for a sports team. It doesn't ever get to the violence that you would expect in Northern Ireland. But then also, strangely enough, Glasgow has the second largest Orange Pride March outside of Belfast. And so the middle of July every year, the Protestants march through Catholic neighborhoods as a form of pride, as a form of antagonism. It's you know, it's both of those things. And so it has a flavor, but it's not like Northern Ireland.
That's a different kind of pride than we think about, you know, here now.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, wait,
That's
where's
true.
pride? Stasha, do you have a question or something?
I do, thanks. So Doug asks, how did the people in your neighborhood where you grew up feel about the way that they were portrayed?
I think you know, that's a good question. I haven't asked all of them, but I think I think they feel okay. You know, I wrote Shuggie Bain as a love letter to Glasgow, but one of the things you have to understand about Glasgow is it doesn't like you to be fake or to tell you any falsehoods. It wants you to be very honest about the situation. And so many of us had a tough time in the 80s that you've got to only just be honest about it. And so what the book has done is I think it's given a lot of people that felt very unseen or very overlooked some kind of voice, something to rally around. So it's been great.
This question speaks to the film version of Shuggie. Who could play Agnes?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. I honestly don't know. It'll be a hard role because Agnes is a woman that goes through an enormous transformation in the book, but she's also a woman who has both internally and then externally two different lives going on. You know, she's beautiful, she's proud, she's a little bit imperious at the beginning, but she begins to disintegrate and become incredibly vulnerable while also sort of hiding that. And so I don't know. I don't think we know yet.
Is there another one, Stasha?
I do have another one. This is from an anonymous attendee, but it relates a little bit to what you were just talking about. Do you see yourself as a Scottish nationalist? And if so, do you see your writing as contributing to a Scottish national culture?
You know, I never answer that question because I think really quickly when Shuggie became a published book, people wanted to politicize me very fast. And I felt I hadn't written a work of nonfiction. I hadn't written a polemic. And literature, if it does anything in the world, should unite people. It should be a thing where anybody, no matter where you're from, who you are, what your beliefs are, should be able to come to a book and you should be able to take something from it. And certainly Shuggie has had me meet the royal family. I got to meet Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall. I got to meet the First Minister of Scotland. I get to meet people in prisons. I get to meet people in the most rarefied circles. I get to meet all these different people, and that's the joy of it. And so for me, I never answer political questions, but my books are pretty political. I can't say that they're not. My politics are probably quite clear in the book. But in a way, I didn't want to write a political novel. I just wanted to write a love story. But then some people, some characters, some communities can't help but be political. They're just born into it.
And if they hadn't asked you those questions before the books, why are they asking? I mean, it's that part too, like yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, there's that funny thing, like suddenly you're a known person and they want to.
I also think one thing that Scottish people don't want to hear is the political opinion of a Scotsman living in New York, no matter what it is, right? They just don't want to hear it. So out of respect for them, I never answer that.
Yeah, I remember one time the author Fatima Bhuttos from Pakistan was traveling around and heard all this flack from people living here about things in Pakistan. I says, well, listen, I'm there living with
Yeah.
living with it, and you're over here kind of at a distance, kind of critiquing what some of us are doing. So it's tricky, all that. So there's a question here about, I think it's sort of evident from both books, there's what feels like some of your story in the writing, and what's that feel like to you to either people project, because there are certainly some books of what we, or I guess again called auto fiction, and I haven't heard that actually put on your books, but some of your story is, the bones of your biography are somewhat in these books.
Yeah, it's really true. They're not works of auto fiction. And in fact, as soon as the chorus rushed in, and it went from being this boy's story, it couldn't possibly ever be my story, because so much of the book is set in rooms that I was just never in, or in years that I didn't exist. And so it becomes a work of fiction. It's entirely a work of my imagination. But, you know, I write from an understanding of what Shuggie goes through. I had a family that was decimated under Thatcherism. I grew up as poor as Shuggie. I was the son of a single mother who lost all of her hope and lost her life to addiction. I was queer and ostracized in the way that Shuggie was. And so I would say I have a parallel life, or the same life as Shuggie, but I never say what part of the book comes from that.
This question, I think, comes from someone who's probably read Mungo, young Mungo. Except I don't know how do you say, what do you say someone's from Glasgow?
Glaswegian.
Glaswegian. So this person, that's why this person says doesn't think Mungo has as much of a Glaswegian accent as some of the other characters. Is that something that you see, or is that there, do you think?
Yeah, I use a device, because actually in Shuggie Bain as well, I don't know who asked that question, so thank you. But in Shuggie Bain, there's not one Glaswegian accent. There's about 6 or 8 of them, and they all use it in different ways. They all, they use it to reveal things about their class, their dreams, their community, their alliances. And it's the same in Young Mungo. It's not just one accent, because if you think about Agnes and Shuggie, she speaks almost like a British newscaster, and yet she's identical to the women around her who speak in quite broad Glaswegian. And when I was thinking about Mungo, I was thinking about how polite and how well-mannered he is as a young man, but also how gay he is, and so how softly spoken he was. And so when I was writing his dialogue, I wanted to take some of the edges of the Glaswegian off of him and make him slightly smoother. It was just a character choice.
Sasha, was another question, or is there?
I have another question from Krishna saying, I love the UK book cover. I think they're talking about the UK book cover for Shuggie. Why did the US change their cover? 2 boys kissing is more powerful, and by changing it, surely that is proof we have not approved homosexuality in this country? Question mark.
Well, there's a copy of the Young Mungo. So I think actually Krishna's talking about the Young Mungo cover.
Young
I don't know if you
Mungo.
would turn it around so the people up there can see it. But I'm really lucky as an author, because my publishers ask me what I want to do on the cover, and I present 4 images, and they get to choose from the 4 images what they want to do. And when my UK publishers, Picador, chose the Wolfgang Tillmans image, I was so excited and nervous and honored. And I didn't know that Wolfgang would allow me to use it. That's a photo called The Kiss. It was taken in 2002. And it's 2 young men who met in a nightclub who are fully dressed and they're kissing. And Wolfgang Tillmans is a really important photographer, but he won the Turner Prize, which is a huge art prize in the UK. And yet when he displayed that photograph in 2002, it was at the Whithorn, which I think is around here somewhere. It's on this coast. Am I making that up? Anyway, someone went into the gallery and they tore it from the wall and they tore it into bits. And this was in, the early 2000s. And when I was thinking about the image that best conveys the love of these 2 young men, but also the hate that they face for that love, that image came to my mind right away. But the truth is America's still a very conservative country. I mean, look at what's happening today with the abortion laws and Don't Say Gay in Florida. It's a country that's wrestling for its moral direction and future. And it's just too big of a country. It couldn't ever take an image like that. And so I had to respect my publisher's understanding of the country they represent.
Nisha, are we doing okay on?
I think we have time for maybe one more.
Okay,
before.
because the other little bit might be if Douglas wants to read a little bit more.
Oh,
short.
yeah, let's.
But this is a question that you may or may not want to, because we're coming to the end of this part. And the other questions that we haven't gotten to, you get to ask Douglas when you get a book signed, or at least chat him up afterwards. But we aren't talking about this in detail, except what does the ending of Young Mungo mean?
Well, I'll spoil it for you if I
Okay,
tell
we
you.
won't. Let's not do it.
No,
Why don't
but
we-
listen, I'll tell you what I do as a writer. I want what I want. I want for my readers what I want for myself as a reader, and I want you to feel bereft and worried, and I want you to think, God, don't go as a character, right? Whoever that character is, I want a book to stay with me long after I close a page. I think there's no bigger sin than finishing a book and then the week after being like, what did I read last week? And so I want that feeling of, God, this really got inside me, and how is Shuggy, and what happened to Mungo? And so I choose endings where you know that a character has so much life still to live, and you want to wonder about that.
I will say that's beautifully done here.
Well,
Very
thank you.
beautifully done. Maybe to close this with some last words from Young Mungo, the book, and from you yourself.
I would love to. This actually comes a little bit later in the book. Mungo, as I said, has been raised by his older sister, Jodie, and Jodie and her mother, Maureen, have a really contentious relationship because Maureen's just very absent. And Jodie is frustrated with Mungo because he loves his mother and she wishes that he wouldn't. Mungo's capacity for love frustrated her. His loving wasn't selfishness, he simply couldn't help it. Momo needed so little and he produced too much, so that it all seemed a horrible waste. It was a harvest no one had seeded, and it blossomed from a vine no one had tended. It should have withered years ago, like hers had, like Hamish's had. Yet Mungo had all this love to give, and it lay about him like ripened fruit, and nobody bothered to gather it up. Mrs. Campbell had once said Mungo's forgiveness was biblical, but Jodie didn't care much for the Bible. She thought it was stupid of him to be so easily exploited. She thought it was a little bit sad, a little bit weak. Her brother had all this love and forgiveness for an elfin wee woman who thought about herself first and last and in between. She was a terrible mother. Jodie didn't like to say that about another woman, but she was. She was terrible. Hamish knew it. Jodie knew it. She wondered when Mungo would too. Mungo sighed in a way that shook her bones. She could see the television reflected in his limpid irises. His pupils had expanded. His gaze was unfocused. I wish you would talk to me, Mungo. He answered her without looking at her. I talk to you every single day. No, I just wish you would tell me everything that you're feeling. Feeling? He thought about it for a moment. I'm hungry again, but I can't be bothered to get up. Jodie shoved him away from her. He was Momo's youngest son, but he was also her confidant, her lady's maid, her errand boy. He was her one flattering mirror in her teenage diary, her electric blanket, her doormat. He was her best pal, the dog she hardly walked, and her greatest romance. He was her cheer on a dreich morning, the only laughter in her audience. Jodie shunted him again, but Mungo only grumbled and curled tighter around her. Her brother was her mother's minor moon, her warmest sun, and at the exact same time, a tiny satellite that she'd forgotten all about. He would orbit her for an eternity, even as she, and then he, broke into bits. Jodie flicked the tip of his nose. Sputnik. Shh, I'm watching this. Jodie ran her fingers through her brother's hair. Mungo smelled of a strange new deodorant, something animal and loud. It was the type of scent the boys in her year smothered themselves in. It was full of pheromones and held promises of a fight or a fingering. It didn't suit him. She sniffed the top of his head. Pack it in. He shifted like he was uncomfortable. As he slowly resettled beside her, he took care to make sure he wasn't squashing her. Jodie thought about how Mungo had molded himself so entirely around Momo, how she had formed him into the exact component piece that she'd been missing, and now that she didn't need him anymore, he was stuck in this weird, specific shape. She wondered what lay ahead for her baby brother. What woman would love him now? She hoped for someone who would be grateful for his good looks and his reticent ways, someone who would feel blessed by his quiet attention, who would take all of his love and keep it safe. There would be girls who would want to mother him forever, who would be reduced by the helpless dip of his eyes into some primitive need to cook and clean and care for him. There could be others who would exploit him, who would feel so low about themselves that they would see his love for them as weakness, something he should be punished for. Mungo's eyes came back into focus. He turned his head to meet her gaze. Who the fuck are you staring at? You, Mungo. I like you. You're good stuff.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Maybe Stasha does this, but Douglas will be signing books. If you know people who couldn't be here tonight, he is tomorrow night at Lake Forest Park's third place. So he gets to experience a little more Seattle tomorrow.
Thank you.
But thank you for that, all that, the reading and the conversation. Lovely.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for being here. Now the back to in-person part of signing books. That's
Before, wait,
something that
wait,
didn't
wait.
get to happen
Before
on
we
the-
all
in
get up,
virtual. And thanks to those who are online too.
you want to rush off stage, Rick, but I want to thank you for doing such a lovely job interviewing. So let's give Rick a round of applause. And for folks who are here in person, our friends at Elliott Bay Book Company have copies of Douglas's books at the table right over there to your right. And if you are staying to get books signed, Douglas is personalizing at the front of the auditorium, but you do need to wear a mask to stand in this signing line. If you're heading out, please exit through the 4th Avenue lobby, which is behind me. That's where most of you came from. So I think it'll be hopefully pretty obvious. And then for folks watching from home, you can find copies of Douglas's books at elliottbaybook.com. And I popped the link in the chat as well. Oh yeah, and he's saying that there'll be pre-signed copies available at the bookstore. So yeah, so you can order those through elliottbaybook.com. And of course, you can find Douglas's books at the library as well. And we're so grateful to everybody who made tonight's program possible. Thanks to Elliott Bay Book Company and our sponsors, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, the Seattle Times, and the Seattle Public Library Foundation. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We'll see you next time. Good night.